I'll be carrying the Halloween energy. Okay. I gotta use good theatrical presentation because I know Kevin is watching, so I can't mess up.
And judging.
Yeah.
And judging. Yeah.
And you will be graded on this later on, Kylie, just so you know.
Dang it.
I am taking notes.
Alrighty. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Halloween Special series. You are tuning in for our very special Pester the Guest episode featuring Kelvin Wetmore. Kelvin Wetmore is truly a jack of all trades when it comes to the entertainment industry. He is a horror writer in both fiction and nonfiction. He's a theatrically trained actor who's appeared in countless productions on stage and screen. He is a professor of theater arts and MFA PP program director at Loyola Marymount University, my alma mater. He is also an excellent director and fight choreographer extraordinaire. Kelvin Wetmore is a member of the Horror Writers Association and a 5-time nominee for the Bram Stoker Award. He's a fabulous DM and all-around horror fanatic. Welcome, Kevin, aka Dr. Wetmore.
Hi, thank you for having me. Happy Halloween, y'all.
Yeah, it's time.
By the time you're all listening to this, it will be Halloween season. But for everyone who doesn't know, it's about a month before. So, but Kylie's clearly
not a holiday; it's a lifestyle and a mindset. It's every day is Halloween if you're doing it right.
Exactly. Thank you. Now I can definitely decorate my house tomorrow, even though my husband says I can't yet. It's a lifestyle.
See, the problem with our house, you can't tell the difference between the regular decor and the Halloween decorations. We're just like, pretty much all the same. So
yeah, there's some overlap. I feel like that makes sense for you guys. You guys always go really hard for Halloween with the costumes and everything.
We do family costumes, and we decorate our front yard. We have a sort of cemetery with ghosts that we put up each year and add stuff to. So, and yes, we do have to the indoor decor, fine. The outdoor stuff, it's like, what will the neighbors put up with? How soon can we get this out?
How soon do you decorate?
We usually put out the outdoor stuff end of September-ish and then take it down mid-November. In 2020, when we're like, oh, we're not having a Halloween, thank you, and we need it earlier. So I think we have a Halloween tree that we have inside with ornaments and fun stuff. So we set that up on like September 2nd, and then when we did the outdoor stuff about a week later because we wanted to get in better spirits during the pandemic. So we didn't give out candy that year, but I have young children, so we did an in-house trick-or-treat where Dad went behind every door, and then the kids would come to the door in costume and knock, and I'd be like, oh, your costumes are great, and put candy in their bags. So because at that point, they were, I think, 6 and 4. So we wanted them to not have a Halloween. So they got to go trick-or-treating in the house, and that year the group costume was Scooby-Doo. My wife dressed like Shaggy. I was the creep, the guy that, so they catch me, wrap me up in rope, and take off my mask. Mr. Magruder. And then they both wanted to be Scooby-Doo, but my wife talked my daughter into being Scrappy-Doo. So we had 2 kids dressed like Great Danes. I was dressed like the villain, and my wife had a goatee and a wig that made her look like Shaggy. So we do themes every year. We did Batman, because my son was really into Batman. So he was Batman. My daughter was Catwoman. I was Bane, and my wife was Jim Gordon. And people did not know she was a woman, so that was fun. When we did Despicable Me, I was Gru, the kids dressed like Minions, and my wife dressed like Dr. Nefario. Because for some reason, she likes dressing up like men at Halloween. That's her big thing. She's like,
how very Shakespearean of her. It's like reverse Shakespeare.
We did Star Trek, because the kids love the Trouble with Tribbles episode. So we dressed our dog as Spock, my wife was Kirk, I was a Klingon, and the kids had outfits that made them look like giant piles of tribbles.
For those of us that haven't seen that Star Trek episode, what are tribbles?
Tribbles are small fuzzy balls, roughly 3 inches in diameter that purr and coo. So in the episode, Captain Kirk ends up in a mound of about 1,005,732 tribbles. But anytime tribbles get near Klingons, they start screaming. So my kids thought that was the best part of Halloween, is anytime they got near Dad in his Klingon outfit, they would just start screaming.
So did you regret that costume at all afterwards, after enduring screaming?
No. Halloween is about the screaming anyway. So it's weird because I like to think of myself as a nice guy. I don't want to hurt anyone. One of the reasons why I became a fight choreographer was to make sure that actors can hurt each other safely without actually suffering any pain or problems. And now I run a literary haunted house at my university's library. which is instead of people jumping out and yelling boo, they jump out and do a scene from Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And it's kind of fun
Oh, that
just
sounds so cool.
watching it run, because it's like 12 or so 5-minute scenes that you go through sequentially. And sometimes they're linked, sometimes they aren't. They're all tied to a central theme. Like last year, the theme was evil fairies, and so it was called The Haunting of Hannon is the main title. Haunting of Hannon 10 Widdershins, because Widdershins is if you walk backwards counterclockwise, actually, around a church, it opens up a gate to fairyland. So we sent people counterclockwise through the library, and then it opened up the basement doors, and they descended into the kingdom of Fae, where things got really scary. But it's for me, it's kind of a pleasure to hear people screaming in the library, and not because they're frustrated over a paper or a final, but because something I wrote has just made them really unnerved. So that's always fun.
Yeah. So I was going to ask later, but I'm curious now. For Haunting of Hannon, were you the original mind that came up with that? And have you been
Yeah.
the writer every year?
Yes, it began as part of a joke that was taken seriously. 11 years ago, the library was doing a special collection exhibit on Gothic novels. And they called me in, since they knew I was a horror writer, and they said, we want to do a couple different things. And at the same time, the campus art gallery was doing this exhibition on sort of really disturbing artwork, occult artwork. And so I got together with the head of the art gallery and the head of the library. And they're like, can you come up with some fun things to do? I'm like, well, we'll create an original performance called The Summoning, using like medieval summoning rituals. And we will carry a casket from the art gallery down to Otis, this art school that's down on Manchester Boulevard, because they were doing something similar. And we got free flashlights that we handed out. So everyone in the audience got a free flashlight that said The Summoning on it, and you could sort of light up the scenes you wanted to see and walk through, because we did it in Dunning Courtyard. And then we carried this casket all the way down and placed the casket in the art gallery at Otis, and then people had to walk out with the cast facing away from them, whispering things. So that was the first thing we did. The second thing we did was called I Bid You Welcome, the Dracula Variations, which is where we did the same scene from 5 different variations of Dracula, 5 different adaptations of Dracula for the stage, to show how Dracula has sort of been presented differently from 1920s through the present day. And then the third thing, I said, well, we're sitting there, and I throw out those 2, and they're like, yeah, we'll do that. And I said, and right around Halloween, if you give me the entire library, I'll turn it into a literary haunted house, and people like jump out and do a scene. And I figured we'd all laugh and then talk about what we'd really do. And the dean of the library went, go on. I was like, well, I'd want to take people down to the basement and to places that we're not ordinarily allowed to go, and it's going to cost a little money. I figured those would be deal breakers, and they're like, we can handle that. What else? So the first time it was just we did 2, one in the afternoon and one in the evening, a family friendly one and then a family unfriendly one. And it was just disconnected scenes. Here's a scene from Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Here's a scene from Edgar Allan Poe. Here's a scene from Dracula. Here's a scene from H.P. Lovecraft. And it was the most popular event that the library ever had. So they came back to me after it and said, can we do it again next year? And I said, well, what's the special collections exhibit? And they said, it's going to be the parents and children of Moby Dick. It's going to be all about literature of the sea. And I was like, okay. So we did The Haunting of Hannon 2, The Last Voyage of the Flying Dutchman. And it was all scenes from literature that deal with like ghost pirates or sea monsters. And then for the third year, the special collection exhibit was about fairy tales as cautionary stories for girls. So we did Little Dead Riding Hood. And it was looking at sort of the ways in which women are represented in fairy tales, and how sometimes, like Little Red Riding Hood fights back. And then the fourth one was about time. So we called it Out of Time. And there was basically this clock ticking throughout the library, and all the scenes were kind of about death. And from then on, each year I say, what's the special collection exhibit? And then we write a dozen scenes about it. So the hardest one was year 6. They said the special collection exhibit theme is collaboration, which is of course terrifying. Yeah. So I said, okay, I like a challenge. And because I'm an academic, I listen to podcasts in the car. And I like not the fun ones. I listen to like hard, deep ones. And so I was listening to a podcast about Dante, and they were talking about Dante's Inferno, and they were talking about how the gates of hell are wide open in Dante's Inferno when Christ comes down and harrows hell, bashes his way into hell, and then when he leaves, he doesn't repair anything. So the gates of hell are wide open, and Dante asks Virgil, why doesn't everybody leave? And Virgil's like, well, they stay here because they think they belong here. And the host of the podcast said, so they collaborate in their own damnation. And I'm like, well, there it is. We're going to do Dante's Inferno. We're going to do Haunting of Hannon 666, the Inferno. We're going to follow Dante and throw in all of these other scenes. So the Circle of Lust was a dance club. There were sort of all these fun scenes. There was a scene of violence, devils, demons, all sorts of scary stuff. The seventh year, I believe, was Mark Twain's travel writing. Then we went online in 2020 for our, which you, I believe, remember.
Yeah, I was in that one.
You were, which was our digital collection because we had to do it online. And then we had two more since then. The last ride on the Cyclone, the special collections exhibit, was about extreme weather. And at the time, I was kind of being inspired by how Hurricane Katrina had hit Six Flags New Orleans. So it's this sort of idea of an underwater amusement park and carnival that had been destroyed by weather. So we had scenes that dealt with extreme weather, but we also had scenes from amusement parks and carnivals, and sometimes combined. And then last year was fairies, and this year, our 11th year, is called The Haunting of Hannon 11, The Library Windows, which is based on a story by a Scottish woman named Margaret Oliphant, who wrote the story about this young woman who the boys are beginning to get interested in. So her parents send her up to her Scottish aunt to stay with her because they're like, well, her aunt will keep her in line and away from the boys. And every night the girl looks out her window at the library across the street, and in the library window she sees this like fine young man. We're talking like Ryan Gosling levels of sweet. And she's like, oh, he's so dreamy. And she waits every night and then looks out her window to see him. And finally, one day during the day, she looks out her window and realizes that entire window is bricked up and has been for like 100 years. When she's looking out the window at night, she's seeing into the past, and she's sort of fallen in love with a ghost. So I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. But the special collections exhibit is about objects which tell a story, how we can sort of get narratives from objects. So I decided we're going to do cursed objects this year. And in keeping with that theme of the library windows, the other windows of the library are not just the windows that are actual windows that you can look out. Every book in a library is a window. You can see the rest of the world through the library windows that are books. So the script plays around with those ideas, and cursed objects, books as windows, and windows as ways that you can see out and see in. So we have a dozen different scenes from different authors and whatnot. That'll be a lot of fun, I hope.
It's so cool how you kind of just fell into this, and as the improv performer you were like, well, I'm gonna run with it and make something cool every year.
Oh,
Yeah.
I fully concede. I love it. I mean, this for me is a treat, coming up with stuff and encountering actors. Only about 2/3 of the script are written before auditions. The last third is written after people audition. Because when folks come in, I'm like, what skills do you have? What talents do you have? And I write scenes. Like last year, we had 3 Filipino students audition. I'm like, would you guys be willing to do a scene about Filipino fairies and do half the scene in Tagalog? And they're like, oh, that'd be so cool.
Oh,
and
cool.
for me, the thrill was seeing then Filipino students sort of coming through the haunt, not being aware of that. And suddenly they walk in on this scene where people are speaking Tagalog and English, or Taglish, they called it. And the sort of face lighting up of, this is my culture. This is, yeah. And I can understand things that these people can't. This is awesome. So we also had a couple scenes in Chinese. We had a Mexican fairy who was told stories in Spanish and also in English, but was encouraging people to dance because he's an Aztec fairy.
Oh, nice.
So, yeah. So I wait and see who shows up and say, oh, we're going to have some fun with this. And we're going to use what languages you speak, what skills you have, what you bring to the table. And then in other cases, like, hey, can you do an Irish accent? Cool, you're in the scene about the banshee.
Well,
that sounds so cool. And now I feel like I got to come out and see that sometime.
It's October 20th and 21st if you're in LA. It's free to the public, and it sells out every year. Every year we expand it a little bit more, and we still end up turning about 100 people away. So
yeah, I'll make sure to link the show info so that way people can come and see. And then for students who haven't auditioned before, or people who go to LMU, it is like the most fun show to audition for. Because I auditioned 1 year in person and 1 year virtually, and the stuff that you get to do is just so different from a traditional audition. It is really fun and chaotic and just gives you space to play. So go see Haunting of Hannon.
Out of curiosity now, Kylie, can you let us all know, at least our listeners and myself know, how exactly did you participate in this, Kylie? What was your part in it?
From what I remember, I was in it in 2020, so it was virtual, and I did one scene with my friend I was talking to on Zoom, and she got by something. She disappeared. And the other one, I was a mad scientist, where I got to be really crazy. And that was really fun because I don't look crazy, so I never would get cast as crazy. But I got to be a mad scientist and torture, which was fun.
That's a scene about how you can actually scare people to death. That which is a real thing that happens. And most of the scene I literally copied, cut and paste out of scientific literature, but the characters are taken from a story by Edgar Allan Poe called The System of Dr. Tar and Professor Feather. And Kylie spent half of the scene chewing on her hair, and the other half being utterly delighted that she got to torture Steve.
Yeah.
And disappointed he finally passed away from fright. For those of you who want to see this, it is still on YouTube. Haunting of Hannon, our digital collection, is on YouTube. It's about an hour long. The truth be told, that was my father's favorite scene. It's the only time my parents have ever been able to see it. They live on the East Coast, so they watched it the next day. And my dad's like, I really like that girl chewing on her hair. She's fun. So,
I'm honored. I have the Wetmore seal of approval.
You do. Hey, if he likes you, you're set for life. And everyone liked the clown. Well, not like the clown, but everyone remembers the clown. And then the one that I got the most questions about was the scene about the two people talking, and you think they're boyfriend and girlfriend, but eventually you find out they're brother and sister.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember seeing that one in rehearsal and also having very similar feelings of, huh? Then, huh? Just so many different emotions happening all at once.
Thank you. That's what we're going for. Is Guillermo del Toro refers to horror as a roller coaster for the soul. And it's not about catharsis. It's not like watching the Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants while eating Haagen-Dazs, where afterwards you have a good cry and you feel better. Horror is about leaving confused and weirded out and like looking around you as you head back to your car. So
exactly.
Mission accomplished.
It's taking simple stories and creating a big emotional reaction.
Yeah.
Well, so since we jumped into the author part, can we ask a couple more questions about your writing career?
Of course. Of course.
So how did you get started as an author and a writer? And what generally has been your path? You've done a lot.
Well, it started off as a scholar. I went to graduate school in Pittsburgh, at the University of Pittsburgh, and I wrote a dissertation. And when you're like a grad student and trying to become a professor, you're also writing lots of little articles and essays about stuff that most people won't actually find very interesting. Shakespeare's erotic use of the semicolon in Measure for Measure, or 3 interesting South African plays. And you're sort of explicating and basically talking to a small group of people who are interested in the same thing. And so I published my dissertation, and then I wrote a few other books on the same topic, and I edited a few collections of scholarly articles. But at the same time, I'm going, the new Star Wars trilogy was coming out at that time, the prequel trilogy, not the new one, but at the time the new one. And I'm looking at that. I'm doing a lot of writing about post-colonial African literature, and I'm watching this going, they're all using the language of colonialism, the empire, the rebellion. And yet, if you look at how people are depicted, how few Black people are in the Star Wars movies, how Asians are depicted, and basically in the first 2 trilogies, they're not, but they are presented as aliens, in the form of aliens. And I was looking at religion, and I thought, I should just write a book about Star Wars from the same perspective, this sort of post-colonial analysis. So I wrote a book called The Empire Triumphant, which did better than anything else I had ever written before. Got me interviews from like big newspapers, and then I got a call from the producers of the Star Wars 30th anniversary special for the History Channel saying, hey, can we come interview you as an international Star Wars expert? And I was like, I need to call my parents first and let them know, hey, Mom, Dad, remember when I was a little kid and you told me no one would pay me to like watch and think about Star Wars? I beg to differ. So that was a lot of fun. And at that point, I said, I can still do the academic stuff, but I should also be writing. I wrote about Star Wars because I love Star Wars, and I recognize that it's a highly problematic narrative, and some of the things that happen in them are questionable. So let's talk about those questions, and without saying this is horrible and no one should watch it, going, hey, this is something you love, but just like if you have kids or a partner, you critique them from a place of love. Hey, your drinking's getting too hard, getting too problematic. About a nickel for every time I heard that. You want to. You say, I still love this thing. It's still wonderful. I hang out with it all the time, but I also recognize these are the issues in it. And so then I started writing about horror cinema. I wrote a book called Post 9/11 Horror in American Cinema, looking at how 9/11 had changed how horror actually works, and sort of some recurring themes there. I wrote a book about zombie movies called Back from the Dead. And I became involved with the Horror Writers Association, the HWA. And some of the people there are like, why don't you write fiction? I'm like, oh, because I write plays and I write nonfiction. They're like, yeah, that doesn't limit you. You're not like, pick the kind of writer you are and you're done. So I was like, oh, okay. So sometime around 2012, I was like, fine, I'll start writing fiction. And I began writing short stories and began selling short stories, and have been in some prestige anthologies and shared table of contents with people like Neil Gaiman and Ramsey Campbell and Stephen King. And I'm like, oh, I'm doing okay, I guess. Sadly, I haven't had as much time to do that lately. I was just sitting down this morning saying, okay, I need to finish these two stories that people had requested. Hey, can you write something for me? And that was back in like May. And I said, oh yeah, I'll get you something by July. And they're like, it's August. Where is it? It's September. Where is it? So now it has to be. But it's completely different set of muscles on the one hand. And on the other hand, as I explained, everything that I do comes back to this idea of story, comes back to this idea of how do we tell each other a narrative? How do we say, here's what happened? And in the case of like the academic stuff, it's, well, if you read the same stuff that I've read, here's what happens when you watch this. Here's what happens when you read this. Here's what happens when you encounter this. And here are some ways to think about it. And then when I write fiction, it's sort of here's a story, and hopefully you'll find it interesting or entertaining. And when I do a play, here's something that I hope will spark inspiration in you, but also terrify you or get you thinking, or you have all the feels. But I think I've done my job if people walk out of the theater going, we got to go somewhere and talk about that.
You've done a good job at creating a piece of art or literature, whatever medium you're going through, if it gets people talking, and especially gets them talking about the hard questions, and having those discussions afterward.
Yeah. Part of sort of what has also driven me, just looking at it in retrospect, I've always been a theater kid. I started doing theater when I was very young. Some friends of mine and I formed a puppet company in 5th grade, and our teacher was very kind. Every Friday, the last half hour of school, and this is in 5th grade, she would let us have to perform our play. So we would write and rehearse and perform a puppet play once a week in 5th grade, me and two friends. And I'm still friends with them, which is wonderful. But so there's always been this love of performing and this love of writing. But then the other thing that I was introduced to then in 6th grade, I think, was Dungeons and Dragons. My cousins began playing it, and they introduced it to me. And I've been playing since first edition. I'm like, oh, this is a cool game. So I got the books and I started playing with friends and folks I met at school. And it's super cool now. But this was back like in high school where you got called a nerd and they would try to wedgie you if you actually announced that you played this publicly. So I consider myself a brave veteran of the nerd wars. Playing D&D, there was a game called Gamma World that I really got into, which is set in the distant future, and you play either pure strain human, or mutant animal. And then there's Call of Cthulhu, which came out in the early 80s. And the weird thing is I got into Lovecraft through Call of Cthulhu, not the other way around. I didn't know about Lovecraft until Call of Cthulhu, and started playing that game. I'm like, well, I should read this Lovecraft guy. And right now I'm actually working on a book on Lovecraft and the stage, because recently there have been a huge number of Lovecraftian adaptations. And it turns out Lovecraft himself was a huge fan of the theater. He loved Shakespeare. He loved Eugene O'Neill. He lived in New York for a few years and would go to see plays on Broadway. So, I mean, he's highly problematic. He's an avowed racist. He's an anti-Semite, and he's highly problematic for a whole bunch of reasons. But he also is responsible for modern horror in many ways. He sort of really changed from the Gothic to the contemporary and the cosmic. And he's a huge theater guy. So I'm like, no one ever talks about that. So let's play with that. So serving as a DM, a GM, a keeper, whatever you want to call it, the person who runs the game, because all role-playing games is collective storytelling with dice. We're going to tell a story together. And then we're going to have, I love this phrase, I can't remember what book it's from, the collective memory of imagined events. That when you sit around with your friends, if you play role-playing games, you're like, dude, remember that time the dwarf took on the ogre? Oh my God, I thought he was dead. And you're like, people who are listening to you going, when did that happen? You're like, oh, in a game 5 years ago. It never happened in real life, but it happened to us. So we have this collective memory of imagined events. And I appreciate that notion of we are telling a story together, and that story somehow is now real for us. Even though we know it's not real in the real world, we have the memory of the events of the story we told each other, and it stays with us. Just like we have memories of movies that, Captain Kirk is not real, but man, a lot of people out there know his life story and value him as a human being. Well, Spock even more, let's be honest. Spock's awesome. That's my job, is to serve as a DM in the theater, a DM in the library, create worlds in which people then get to play characters and make decisions and roll the dice.
So when you typically have your DM hat on, then how do you balance the trying to create constraints in the world that you've generated versus allowing your players or your actors to have their own free will in their decision making, and trying to roll with that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think being a DM really influenced me as a director and how I became a director, in as much as just like no battle plan survives contact with the enemy, no script survives contact with the actors, no module survives contact with the players. That you carefully plan all this stuff out and you show up on the first day and go, okay, this, and they're like, okay, we light torches and go into that other hole. And you're like, no, you're not supposed to go in there. And they're like, that's where we want to go. And so sometimes it's about making it up on the fly, but rather than get frustrated, I discovered, no, this is collaborative storytelling. So if that's where they want to go, my job is to then expand the grid, so to speak, and give them stuff to do there. That part of my job might be, well, you actually have to get on this quest over here. But I mentioned earlier, I have young children, and just this past summer we started playing D&D because my wife and I play with
Oh.
friends, and the kids are like, what are you guys doing? Those dice are so cool. We want to play. So I had them create characters, and they skipped most of the dungeon. Like, they found the direct route through. And I was like, there's all this other stuff that you guys missed. And they're like, yeah, but we got out and we had money and we lived. It's like, yeah, I mean, you missed out on some of the fun, but congratulations, you now have, magic items and money, and you've leveled up. So let's go on to the next adventure. And the next adventure, they nearly died on the first encounter. Like, the dice were just not on their side and they had to run out of the dungeon. I'm like, okay, then go back to, the city and heal your wounds and figure out what you did wrong. But the funny thing is, they didn't do anything wrong. It was just the dice. So part of it is that notion of your job is not to push the actors or the players into what you want, but rather if you're doing it right, you've created a world in which they feel free to play the role and imagine themselves richly in this world and make choices that are sometimes better than what the dungeon master would have come up with. Now, sometimes it's hack and slash. Sometimes you're just screwing around with friends. We have beer. We have D&D. And you walk into a cavern. There's a giant altar with a goblin skull on it. I take the skull as a souvenir. And you're like, oh, okay. It's going to be one of those games.
Roll initiative.
Yeah. But then, like the game we played during the pandemic, where for me, the pleasure of it as a longtime player was watching these college students who were encountering this game as part of a play that we had started and couldn't do because of COVID, start to get together on Zoom once a week and play, is how emotionally attached they became to this group. And when a character would die, or in this case, an elephant would die, the heartbreak was real. And like, people are like, can we stop playing right now? I need to process my grief. And they were serious, that the emotions were real because this, we had invested time and effort into telling the story together, and these characters were important. And so they were excited when they, almost lost, but just barely won and emerged triumphant, and were heartbroken when there was actual loss. And so to me, that's sort of the best of what this is we're collaboratively creating. This is what drives Plato crazy in the Republic. Plato, I'm sure, would not allow D&D either, because it's something that's completely fake, that creates real emotions, that creates real thoughts. Truth cannot come from something false, says Plato. D&D is completely false, and yet we have true experiences based on it. So that's a very long and roundabout way of answering your question, but the answer is, if I'm creating a world, then whatever they do is right. And then I'm the one who then has to adjust. Now, I can make suggestions, and I think Kylie can attest to this firsthand, where I say, what does your character want to do? I want to do this. Okay, you can do that, but here are the ramifications of that choice. Here are some other choices. Whatever you do will be the right choice, but feel free to explore the other ones if you want to go a different direction. And that's also in theater why we rehearse, and in D&D why we sometimes, the D&D will fudge, the DM will fudge the dice, or we'll say, you know what, let's backtrack. Let's go back to Saltmarsh and rethink this one.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned collaboration a lot. That was
Yeah.
a word that just kept hitting me over and over. And the beginning phase of your storytelling, whether you're writing a RPG to play or you're writing a fiction or nonfiction, you're writing alone. So how is
Yeah.
that process different for you than like the rehearsal when you're with people finally?
Well, okay, there are sort of two different things there. One, even when you're writing alone, you're writing with other people in mind. You're trying to imagine yourself in the audience's position. So, for example, with the Haunting of Hannon, it's one of these things where I'm like, oh, okay, I've got 4 minutes and a $50 budget, per scene, and this, that, the other thing. how do I make this effective? And I try to imagine how the audience will encounter this. And sometimes solutions will come up in rehearsal. Sometimes when I'm writing a script, I'll be like, we'll figure it out. Because off the top of my head, I don't know how to make this happen, but I want it to happen. So we'll figure it out in the rehearsal room, or one of the tech guys, Rob will come in and go, oh, just put a doorbell there. I'm like, oh, I never even thought of that. Simple solution. People come up with solutions that are so elegant and fun. So you try to imagine the audience, try and put yourself in the place, and what will surprise them, what will make them afraid. And the danger is because fear and laughter are so close to each other. Some people laugh when they're afraid, but also, we've all watched scary movies that actually aren't that scary. So you laugh because of how dumb, the monster pops up and you're like, that's stupid. And you chuckle. And so that's every horror nightmare, horror maker's nightmare, is that your scare moment is not scary, it's funny. And then learning how to negotiate that as well. That, okay, then if it's going to be funny, then make it funny, but make it disturbingly funny. Kylie, chew your hair and stare at the camera. And people are then laughing, but they're like, after a while, that gets really creepy. And so you can find ways to turn things. The audience is the one thing, however, that you can never, ever rehearse. We did a scene with, there was this guy playing Don't Fear the Reaper really slow on the acoustic guitar. And on the table behind him was a young woman dressed all in black in full Dia de los Muertos makeup, surrounded by Santos candles all lit. And he's playing Don't Fear the Reaper very slowly. And the direction was, the audience will come in, pick one person and just stare at them while you sing. And then the woman in back, about halfway through the song, would just sit up, turn to the audience, fixate on one guy in the audience, and start going, love me. And you would see that she had like a bullet hole in her forehead with dried blood. And she would start moving towards him, and he'd stand up, and as the guitar moved, you'd see there was a gun in his hip, and he would say, darling, this is how we got in trouble in the first place. And then he'd look at the audience and say, time you moved on. And people would be like really disturbed by the slow guitar playing, by this thing sitting up, and by the implication of domestic violence and murder. And she would come over and then like hug him, and they'd smile and kiss. So there was this sort of happy ending of sorts, but the whole thing was meant to be disturbing. 99 times out of 100, incredibly effective. People walked out going, that was so creepy, that's going to haunt me tonight. This one time, the young woman that he's singing to is staring at him and having a hard time focusing. About halfway through the song, in a quiet moment, she goes, dude, you're too hot and I'm too high. This isn't going to work. And she walks out, and the whole audience just burst into laughter. And the actors were like, well, no. We can't come back from that. Like, there's no way to get back that scary mood. So goodbye, folks. Thanks for coming.
Oh my gosh.
Hopefully no one else that high will come through again. But this year, and again, we know that we have people coming through. It's become this big thing on campus. People come all 4 years to see it. So this year we began with, we always try to change the route for some surprises. So this year people walked in the library, they get in the elevator and they go up to the 3rd floor. And when the doors open, there are 2 druids standing there, young women in, floor-length brown robes with black stripes painted across their eyes and designs on their faces, and burning candles in a big bowl of candy corn. And they're like, you should not have come here tonight. And people didn't want to get out of the elevator. In fact, perhaps my favorite moment of last year, which is when this happened, is I'm standing around the corner just to listen into it. And this was like the second run. Listen to hear, I hear the elevator doors open, and I just hear this voice go, oh crap, it's already started. Because it's like, oh, we're already going into this now. And they started this thing now where they're interviewing people as they leave to ask, what was good, what was your favorite moment? And most of the people reported, yeah, this was actually really scary. Like, there were educational moments, there were moments where we learned about Filipino fairies, but the banshee, the guy in the basement, Puck, that was messed up, man. And so, cool. So you try to anticipate what's going to be effective, what's going to be scary. You try to challenge your designers. One of the things I came up with is this character holds a jar full of fireflies. And so Johnny's like, how do I do that? And he got a jar and he got a string of Christmas lights and sort of fogged the jar and put the Christmas lights in it. And they were operating on a battery. So you see these lights blinking on and off in the jar. And in the dark of the basement of the library, it looks like a jar full of moving fireflies. I would have never come up with that on my own. I just told him he had to create this somehow. So part of the fun is also giving other artists a fun task to solve, a problem, a challenge, come up with how we do this. And they will always come back with, okay, I have an idea. And 9 times out of 10, it's so effective and so fun. So sometimes it's convincing your actors, trust me, this will work. And they're like, I don't trust me. And there are other times when the actor's like, I don't think this is going to work. And I'm like, if you don't think it's going to work, it's not going to work. You have to make it work. So I at this point in my career, I know when something will work, regardless if an actor thinks they can do it or not, or if it requires the actor committing to it. And if they won't, then we have to change it. And then after that, it's up to the audience. So
that just reminded me of the various times that I've worked with you. You always had either like just suggestions I never would have thought of, or I would come to you with something where I'm like, I'm going to try something crazy. I don't know, chew on my hair for half an hour on camera. And, maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. But
the answer was always,
yes,
do it.
Yes, and yeah.
Yes, do it. Let's see what it is. Let's see how it works. And then sometimes you get back, don't just chew on the hair. Sometimes pretend it's a mustache. Keep going. And there you go. We inspire each other and come up with effects that are so simple and yet so incredibly powerful. And the audience sort of doesn't pick up on that, but there's a process behind it where you get to the point of, okay, now it works. But it takes weeks of experimentation to get that right. It's William Gillette who says theater is the illusion of the first time. We do something over and over and over again to make it seem like we've never done it before. And in order to get there, the other phrase that I love to use is make believe is a lot of hard work.
It really is. And that kind of wants me to lead into your acting career. So
Sure.
You said you started with your puppet career in 5th grade.
Yeah.
Where did you go from there? I mean, you didn't become a puppeteer. I know your wife puppeteers.
She's a puppeteer, yes. Her puppet Chip has an Instagram account, and they're quite lovely. You should check it out. Well, from there, I did school plays, the Hillbillies and the Robots. I did youth theater. There was a theater in my hometown where junior high school kids were putting on plays based on fairy tales. So I did that a few times, and that was fun. And then when I got in high school, I joined the drama group, and we were doing musicals. And my high school also had a one-act festival every fall where each class would put on a play, and it was a competition. And my class was the first freshman class to win it ever. It was the first time the first-year students won. So we were quite proud of that, and also under death threat from the seniors because they thought they were going to win. So from there, I started doing a lot of theater, and I went off to college. And I've loved Shakespeare ever since I was 8 years old. True story. I'm not going to get into my sordid history.
I got to ask though, what's your gateway show? What Shakespeare show was like your?
It wasn't a show. I read the play Julius Caesar as an 8-year-old, and went, this is cool.
That's impressive as an 8-year-old too.
It was impressive and weird. I was a weird kid.
I still need the little translations on the side just to even tackle any Shakespearean work. So
I don't hear like 8 years old, but at 8 I needed them, and I'm sure I didn't get a lot of it, but I'm just sort of reading it and going to my father with questions. And voracious reader from a very early age. I taught myself to read at age 3 because I would see my parents read, and I'm like, I want to do that too. So I'm sounding out words, and the other kids are doing book reports on My Little Pony, and I'm like, I think I want to read The Scarlet Letter. And my teacher's like, that's a little advanced for you. I was like, okay, I'll do Julius Caesar. So I started reading Shakespeare. I loved Macbeth. I love the plays that had big meaty roles. In high school, I read Titus Andronicus. So I'm reading Shakespeare going along. And I got my first professional acting gig when I was 18 at New Haven Shakespeare on the Green, playing Curio in a production of Twelfth Night. So it's me and all these professional actors. I had 4 lines, and I'm like, this is so cool. And I'm hanging out with these adults. It was also sort of one of the saddest moments of my then young career, where we show up for the read through, and the woman playing Mariah is sitting next to me, and we read through the play, and I'm puckish and amusing, I'm cracking jokes, and I was like, oh, this kid's funny. And so she turns to me at the end of it and goes, you want to go for a drink? And I was like, oh, I'd love to, but I'm 18. And she goes, oh, you want to go for ice cream? And I'm like, you just made it worse. Let's go to a diner, anything else but ice cream. And yes, I do want to go for ice cream. Is it your treat? Because I can't drive So it was a great experience. I got to meet all these cool people. It was a lot of fun. And I went off to college, and I did Strindberg. At the end of my freshman year, I went back to my hometown, and I said, we have this theater in our Central Park, and we're not really using it for anything. You do like a jazz concert on the 4th of July. So give me that theater for the summer, and I'll create a Shakespeare festival. And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, I'm a professional actor. I was just in Shakespeare on the Green in New Haven last year. So this summer, give me money and give me the support and let me have the park, and I'll create a Shakespeare festival. And now at the time I was 18. I think I might have just turned 19 when I made this proposal to the town council. And by all rights, they should have said no. They should have laughed me out of there. And instead they said, as so often happens in my life, go on. And so they gave me $10,000 in the space, and we did Midsummer Night's Dream and for our first show. And the funny thing is, they made this big announcement: we're doing Shakespeare in Cheshire Park. It's a new Shakespeare festival that the town is sponsoring. And I get this call from this guy who I'm Kevin Jr. So half the time when this is back in the 80s, so the wall phone would ring, they would ask for Kevin, and my mom would give it to my father. My father's like, I think you want my son, and gives it to me. I'm like, hello, Kevin. My name is Larry. I've designed on Broadway. I'm retired. I live in Cheshire now. Do you have a designer for your show yet? I'm like, no, but you design on Broadway. And he's like, yes. I'm like, I'm 18. He goes, are you the artistic director? I said, yes. He said, are you the director of the show? I said, yes. Then your age is irrelevant. How do you have a designer yet? And he was wonderful and taught me a lot. And it's one of these things where I was like, okay, I'm going to call the local scaffold company, because Larry's like, we need lighting trees. I'm like, okay. So I call up the local scaffolding company. I'm like, we'll give you free advertising. You can put up a sign in the park if you give us free scaffolds to use for lighting trees and for tech support. So they lent us $30,000 worth of scaffolding all summer long for free. And this continued for the next 3 years until I left for England. And it kept going for like 3 more years after that. And then he stopped doing Shakespeare and started doing musicals. But, I at age 19, I was the artistic director of a Shakespeare festival in my hometown, doing 2 shows every summer.
Holy
And
cow.
then, yeah. And
Wow.
again, I should have been told no every step of the way. No one should have let me do this. But it's one of those things where if you do your research, if you present yourself like you know what you're doing, and you have any sort of credibility, people are like, yeah, okay, go ahead. So, I started a Shakespeare company when I was doing graduate school in Pittsburgh. Started Shakespeare on the Bluff at LMU, went to the dean and said, give me money and we'll do Shakespeare here. And we'll go down to Playa Vista and we'll perform there too. And the people in Playa Vista were like, cool, what do you need? And I've discovered, a lot of times people will say no when you propose stuff, but sometimes if you have something that people are like, oh, that'd be cool. How do we help? What do you need? And if you don't actually need that much, cool, yeah, we'd love to have you do that. So we're now in our 6th year of Shakespeare on the Bluff, 11th year of Haunting of Hannon. I just heard that the theater that I started in Cheshire is doing something next summer now. So for me, that's the fun of it, is having this idea of it would be cool to do this and getting enough people to buy in. My wife sometimes describes me as a Kermit. She's like, you're this crazy organized frog that gets all these other people to buy into the thing, and do it. So
I think we all
so,
need a
That
Kermit in the theater industry. Out of when there's so many creatives, like you need
yeah.
somebody who says, I'm going to make it happen. Pew, 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 pew. And brings
Mhm.
everything together.
So long as you don't try to do it all yourself, so long as you say, I'm going to make it happen, and I need you and you and you, and you got to
You got
do
to be
this
a
and you got
good
to do that, and they're like,
delegator.
cool, I'll do it. And you get people who get excited to do it. There are a lot of people who are willing to act, and you say, look, I'm happy to have you act. I just need a couple hours of your time to help build the set once we're ready to. And most people are like, yeah, I'll show up Saturday and paint a set or whatever. Cool. And so, it's, for me, it's immensely gratifying, to look at a show at Shakespeare on the Bluff or at the Haunting of Hannon or the other things that I do and just go, I made that happen. Like, that did not exist 6 months ago, and now it's a thing that 100 people are involved in, and hundreds, if not thousands, of people are seeing because I had an idea. So that's, without getting egotistical, that's sort of the fun. So going all the way back to your original question, I did a lot of acting, especially when I was younger. Went to England, I did a lot of acting there. I did a lot of acting in Pittsburgh, did a lot of classical acting, but I also, again, 40 years and 30 pounds ago, played Dr. Frank in Rocky Horror in England and again in Pittsburgh. I've done a lot of weird avant-garde stuff, some stuff here in town. When I first moved to LA, I was doing a lot of indie features, a lot of low-budget horror. I've been killed by zombies, by werewolves, by serial killers. I've been a medieval knight who was reincarnated as a supermodel. I can always tell when one of my films has been on the Sci-Fi Channel because a student will come in and be like, "We saw you last night." I'm like, "2 a.m. Sci-Fi Channel? Yeah. How did I? Tell me how I died, and I'll tell you which film it is."
That's so
So
cool.
but I got to work with Danny Trejo. I got to work with the voice actor who does the Emperor on Star Wars, Clone Wars, which was cool. I was like, dude, I know your work. This is awesome. So I got to work with Norman Reedus back before Walking Dead. So I was never a star. I never did anything huge, but I did enough stuff that, like, this is going to pay my mortgage for this month, or and doing plays around town. So I enjoy acting. It's fun. Before I had kids, I used to do a lot of stand up, but now I'm much more into the writing and directing, and I find it to be much more gratifying, although I just played Falstaff this summer in Merry Wives of Windsor, and then I played Duncan in the Scottish play. And my daughter's name is Cordelia, and she's 7 years old. So I keep telling her, in 9 more years, we're doing King Lear. You'll play your character and I'll play the title role.
So acting was like your gateway into this whole other world of artistry that was opened up to you the older you got. Because like an artist, you know, they go through so many phases. You could do artistry for forever. You just got to keep discovering different things that you enjoy. And one thing that I want to circle back to. So you had so many like, okay, go on moments, but what were some challenges that you've had in your career? Some maybe no's, or some didn't work out quite the way you wanted it to.
There are tons of no's. There's all the way back in 2003, 2004, I'd been working in a theater called the LA Connection, and I was doing a lot of stand-up, and I had met some folks, and a writer that I had worked with who had turned into a producer wanted to produce a show that he asked me to write. He's like, I want you to, the election's coming up. I want you to write a political satire. So I wrote a political satire, and all these jokes are dated now, called John Ashcroft Explains It All for You. And John Ashcroft at the time had been a senator from Missouri who lost his election to the Democrats, who had nominated a guy who then died. So he lost his election to a dead man. And then Bush had made him his first attorney general. And he insisted, like, Ashcroft was this extreme conservative who insisted the Greek statues in the Department of Justice be covered up because there should be no naked breasts in the Department of Justice. And like, dude, it's a classical statue. And he would have these press conferences that showed him to be not necessarily super bright. So I'm like, oh, we have to have fun with this. And I wrote a show called John Ashcroft Explains It All for You. The big final scene was the Democratic nominating convention because Barry White had just died. We should nominate someone that a lot of people would vote for. Let's nominate Barry White. And they're like, oh, he just died. Yeah, but John Ashcroft loses against dead people, so it's okay. Well, then we need to nominate a vice president that's older and more experienced. More experienced at being dead? Yeah, like Marvin Gaye. Yeah, Barry White and Marvin Gaye should be our ticket in 2004. And then one of the other characters like, no, because then the bumper stickers will say White and Gay in 2004. And do you think anyone's going to vote for that? And it devolved into all sorts of silliness. And it was brilliant and it was wonderful. And he couldn't raise the money. And I'm like, dude, I spent months writing this thing and it was brilliant. This was going to be my big breakthrough. A few years later, I was cast in a sort of mockumentary called Zen and the Art of Yard Sailing. And it's about these two guys who every weekend go around to yard sales. This is how they make their living, because eBay was still kind of new. They'd go to yard sales, buy stuff, fix it, and sell it on eBay for like 3 times what they paid for it. And so it was this documentary crew following them around. But the way that they did it is me and the other actor were named Buck and Lance. They would film us at actual yard. We'd go to actual yard sales and interact with people in character. And like he was the shy one and I'm the obnoxious one.
That tracks in a positive way. You know, you've got like the extroverted
it's one of those things
energy.
where someone would turn to me and be like, how much is this coat? I'm like, oh, this ain't my yard sale and I'd never buy anything like that. Oh, it'd look good on you though. And then the PAs would run over and be like, would you sign this release? We're making a documentary about these 2 professional resellers. And they would interview us. And again, it's all improv in the moment. And the whole idea is that my character is the one who's Zen. He's like, I'm a Zen Buddhist, and Buddhism teaches you the 4 noble truths, which are life is suffering, get the best bargain you can, all right, wash the clothes before you wear them. Like Buddha teaches you all this stuff, man. Or say things, and I would say things. I'd meet someone at a yard sale and be negotiating to buy something. They'll be like, I can't go lower than $10. I got inner peace because I'm a Buddhist, but right now the Buddha's telling me to punch you in the face, man. That's just not cool. That is not cool. And they'd be like, I'm sorry. And then afterwards, they would be like, I'm so sorry. I'm an actor. I'm in character. I'm just screwing with you. It's fine. But you'd get their honest reactions to me being this sort of very abrasive Buddhist. And we, every weekend at 4 a.m., I had to go to the studio every weekend for like 8 weeks in a row. Our call times were 4 a.m. on Saturday and Sunday. So we could get there, get in costume, get in the van because the yard sales start at 7 a.m. And they're like, we have from basically 7 to noon to film you guys. And so they got something like 400 hours of footage over the course of it. Because then there were other things that we did where I ran like a Buddhist meditation group for yard sailors. So, and the funny thing is all the people in that were the people who had auditioned for my part and didn't get it. So it's all these guys who kind of look like me and we're all sitting around. And because I was cast, they vaguely resented me anyway. So they're like, you don't like this guy, but want to learn from him. because he does
Oh
what you
my
do, but better.
gosh.
And so
That's
we're all
so
kind of,
well cast of them. Like,
it was
here.
so smart. So the whole point is, this is brilliant. This was going to be my breakthrough thing. I'm like, if this gets out there and it gets a few, festival things, this might push me up into like great representation getting out there. And they never finished editing it. The guys who made it like got it on another project and never went back to it. And every 2 or 3 years, I get an email saying, "Hey, as soon as we get the chance, we're going to go back and edit this footage." And I'm like, "Guys, it's 17 years old. Like, who wants to see that? Like, all the references are out of date. But it broke my heart because it's one of the best things I ever did. I was so proud of that work. There are also moments along the way where I was at a workshop or I was performing stand up and I was invited to do something and I was like, no, I'm cool. And in hindsight, I went, I should have gone. I should have done that because that would have taken, actually, that would have been a smart career move. When
Yeah.
I was at the National Stage Combat Workshop back in 2000, and one of the fight masters, a guy I admired for years, we were all sort of in the cafeteria having lunch, and he comes down, sits next to me. We start talking. We're having a really good talk, and he's like, "Oh, so do you want to, is it your hope someday to be a fight master? Do you want to learn to train? Do you want to take it to the next level?" And foolish me being honest, I'm like, yeah, but I do a lot of other things, and I know to be a fight master, that really has to be your focus, and that's the only thing you do. So I'd be content to be a certified teacher. I just want to be kind of at the level I'm at or just a little bit above. It's like, good, thanks. And walked away. And like later that day, I was like, he was asking if I wanted to take it to, he wanted to train me. He wanted me to commit
Yeah.
to, damn it. Because the other thing that happens in my life, if I might be so bold, and I'm feeling so egotistical having this whole conversation about me,
No, you're
Don't
good.
worry
That's the
about
whole
that.
point of the
It's,
conversation. If we're
Yeah.
interviewing you.
is half the time when good things have happened to me. Half the time when things happen, it's because no one who tells me no, who should have told me no, tells me no. Instead, I'm like, I'm going to start a Shakespeare festival. Give me a Shakespeare festival. Okay. I'm going to start a Shakespeare festival here. Give me a Shakespeare festival. Okay. Or someone comes to me and says, "Hey, do you want to do this?" I was like, "I didn't until you asked me, but now I do. What are we doing?" And so things sometimes, when I was in grad school, I was called into my mentor's office. And at that time, I was studying African theater, Shakespeare, and Japanese theater. Those were my three major areas. So my Japanese mentor calls me in and goes, "When are you leaving?" I'm like, Leaving for what?" He goes, "I completely forgot to tell you. We got a Toshiba Foundation grant and selected you will fund a research trip to Japan for the summer." And I was like, "Oh, yeah, I didn't know that." Well, I was just cast in a Shakespeare show, and I'm hearing myself say this out loud, and I go, "I'm leaving in June." He's like, "Well, we'll handle all the arrangements. Tell us." And I'm like, "Say yes, just say yes to this. Don't come up with reasons why you can't go. Go to Japan for 3 months." And again, it was life changing when I had the opportunity to go to Africa, when I was working in England, and someone said, "Hey, come do this." Okay, yeah. And inevitably, I end up, I went to England to study Shakespeare and ended up studying African and Japanese theater there. Like that's the other thing of my life is it's nothing but accidents and mistakes that work out incredibly well. I went to England and I show up at the University of Leeds. I'm like, "Hey, I want to start the MA here. I'm really into Shakespeare." And they're like, "Oh, our Shakespearean's on sabbatical. What else can you do?" I'm like, "What else can I do? Like, what else is there?" And they're like, "Oh, well, we do, and they list the, British political theater and community-based theater. We also do African theater and Japanese theater." I'm like, "Japanese theater, like kabuki?" And they're like, "No, modern theater." I'm like, "Japan has a modern theater?" And they're like, "You're so American." But I started studying modern Japanese theater in England under Masako Yuasa, and I started studying African theater under Martin Banham. And I'm like, I had no idea that any of this stuff existed. This is so exciting. And just that alone changed the entire course of my life. And I ended up studying with Dennis Brutus, who's this South African poet who was like Nelson Mandela's cellmate for several years and was
Oh my
booted out of
Oh.
South
goodness.
Africa and taught at the University of Pittsburgh. And I was like, "Excuse me, Professor Brutus, I want to talk to you about African theater. And I know you that, and he's like, so long as we play chess together." I'm like, "What?" He's like, "I want to play chess. No one plays chess with me. If you play chess, we'll talk about theater while we play chess." So I'm like, "We will play chess then, sir." And we kept playing chess and talking about African theater. And he turned out to be a major influence on my life as well. So I've been fortunate in that I've found a large number of mentors and a lot of people who, just by asking them, "Hey, can I learn from you? Can I study with you?" opened so many doors. And so at this point, any good things that I have come from standing on the shoulders of giants that, I became interested in horror. I joined an organization and immediately sort of fell in with the people who run that organization and who were like, "Hey, you're cool and you're kind, and why don't you come and play with us?" And now it's just fun that there are people out there whose work I was reading in high school who I'm now Facebook friends with, and when I see them at cons, they're like, "Hey, Kevin," and I'm like, "Joe R. Lansdale just said hi to me. Brian Keene knows my name. This is so cool." And I can't help but geek out at these things. So it's just I've been very fortunate. I've been very blessed. I have been very privileged. Let's call it what it is. I have a lot of privilege, and that has allowed me to do a lot of things that I've been able to do. And for me, the joy of that is, as a professor, I get to open all these doors for my students and encourage them to run through and travel further than I have. As Master Yoda reminds us, we are what they exceed. It is your hope that your students go farther and do better than you ever did and create absolutely wonderful and fun things. In fact, I'm doing a student film this month from a student who I had as a freshman in a horror theater class, who's like, "I really want you to play the professor in my movie." So I'm like, "Yeah,
Aw.
cool." And I love when moments like that happen, where someone who I taught now wants to work with me on a thesis or professionally. The person who directed Macbeth is a student I've known at LMU since her freshman year, and brought her into the world of stage combat. And now she's a professional actor and a teacher and professional director and stage combat choreographer on her own. She was the president of the Dueling Arts International. Like I taught her stage. I was the first one to teach her stage combat, and now she outranks me, and I love it. That's what you want to see.
I feel like I should have had a notepad for all that, like taking notes.
It seems like you have lived a life that most people will just kind of dream about. And honestly, I loved hearing about your was it your experience with studying Japanese
Yes.
literature and theater? And I mean, like that kind of explains how the Japanese reading you gave us
Yes.
earlier.
I'm
Uh,
thinking a lot in Japanese lately because I'm teaching a course in Japanese. It's called Japanese Theater into Film, where we look at indigenous and traditional plays from Japan, and then we look at films influenced by them. So I've been watching a lot of Japanese cinema in the past month and teaching this course this past week, and it's using all that Japanese language. I'm just back in the mindset. It's fun. If I had been teaching my African course, I probably would have graded you in either Kiswahili or Isizulu or something.
I'm very jealous about that. I tried teaching myself Japanese like all last year. Didn't really have much of an opportunity to use it though. I think there's a couple more questions
Of
we
course.
definitely want to hit on. Actually, there was one I was genuinely curious about with you. Just
Sure.
kind of so scanning your room a bit there. I hope you don't mind. Uh, I can see. So it looks like so you have a Christian background at
I
least,
do.
and so that makes me want to ask a question I've actually been genuinely kind of curious about too, which is being both a Christian and a huge fan of horror fiction, the whole horror genre. How do you reconcile both worlds in that case? Because I feel like the go-to belief is that the two worlds don't typically mix well. Um,
And nothing could be further from the truth.
so I'd
And
love to hear your opinion on that.
sure. Well, let's get specific here in a couple different ways. One, I'm Catholic, and it makes it a lot easier to be a horror fan when you're Catholic because The Exorcist, demonology. In fact, the crucifix is here, and all these books in front of it are my theology books, and there's a number of books at the bottom here. One, two, three, four, five, six, 7 books about horror cinema and Christianity. And I've contributed to a number of books like Horror and Theology, Wes Craven and Theology, Zombies and Theology, looking
Oh,
at the intersection of religious faith, religious belief, and the tropes of horror culture. As someone who has more degrees than a thermometer, none in anything useful, one of those degrees is a master's of theology. In fact, I wrote a book about the theology of Battlestar Galactica, the TV series, because there are so many important theological themes in that work. I'm like, I have to do this. And so, in terms of horror, I recognize the concern about allowing evil into your life and opening yourself up to darkness and all that. But the funny thing about a lot of scholars is they're looking at it going, when you look at it, sort of the first horror book ever is the Bible. You've got witches, you've got
Yeah.
demons, you've got all these horrible things happening in it. You've got executions, you've got the body destroyed. There's quite a bit of horror to be found within Christian narratives themselves. Jonathan Mayberry, the New York Times bestselling author, who I'm a big fan of, put it best because his father was the head of the KKK in Pennsylvania. And
ooh.
he is so not that. He's the exact opposite of that. He's like, growing up with a person that I kind of hated. He was my father, and I hated him because of what he was. Taught me that there are monsters in the world, and there are monster slayers. And we don't go to horror because we support the monsters.
Mm.
We don't go to horror going, man, I hope Jason gets those kids. Man, I hope those kids get slaughtered. Yes, we might be there to see the interesting deaths, but the whole point is it's about the guys fighting the monsters. It's about how we resist the monsters. And isn't that what Christianity literally is all about? Resisting evil and fighting for good. Horror is the one film genre that actually commits to what Christianity claims. Supernatural evil is real, and it is out there, and it is a force. You're not
Mhm.
seeing that in your mainstream, dramatic narratives. But The Exorcist is a film that says the devil is real, evil is real, demons are real, and clergy can fight it, and prayer can fight it. Now, there's certainly a lot of nihilistic horror out there. There's a lot of atheistic horror out there. There's a lot of horror that exists just for prurient reasons. No one comes out of a Serbian film or I Spit on Your Grave going, man, that gave me a lot to think about. Time to reflect on my prayer life. That's not going to happen. But at the same time, there are a number of horror movies that I watched. I'm like, this raises important theological questions. This raises important issues about what it means to be human. I mean, the very idea that monsters are real immediately starts questioning, okay, what is the difference between monster and human? We certainly see this, for example, in George Romero's zombie films, that we move very quickly from them to those things out there. And you're like, those used to be people. They're living, breathing, and now they're zombies. But dude, that's your sister. No, it's a thing. And immediately the language shifts and you start thinking about, okay, we can talk about what it means to be human, but we can also talk about how this film shows in a way that doesn't challenge you overtly, but the dangers of thinking of the other, the people who
Mm.
are not like me, who are therefore judged. And
Mhm.
so I think a lot of horror out there creates what the Japanese call mitate, distance. And this is I'm going all sorts of places here, but just go with me on this.
Love it.
Uh,
I'm
um,
tracking you. Don't worry.
there are only two films that were made about 9/11, the actual experience of 9/11, and that's United 93 and Oliver Stone's World Trade Center, both of which were commercial and critical flops. Nobody wanted to
Mhm.
go see movies about 9/11. And both of
Yeah.
those films, by the way, are the only ones that present heroic stories. Nicolas Cage is a firefighter who runs into the burning building to save people. United 93, the plane that the passengers brought down so it didn't crash into the Capitol or the White House or whatever. There were heroic narratives of 9/11, and no one wanted to see that. What were the big movies after 9/11? Cloverfield, The War of the Worlds, you know, movies about New York being destroyed, movies about people having to face these incredible monsters and not knowing how to deal with it. Suddenly, found footage explodes everywhere. We see films that are full of people running away from things. And we see movies about people flying up into the air or being dropped down to the ground. And that's because we sublimated 9/11 into horror cinema. And horror cinema said, actually, here's the best example of this. Before 9/11, there were maybe a dozen or so shows about ghost hunting on television.
Mm.
Within the first 5 or 6 years after 9/11, there were over 300. Why? Two reasons. One, ghost hunting shows say the supernatural is real, that we survive, that there is life after death. And isn't that comforting? 3,000 souls died within, seconds, terribly painfully. But guess what? Life goes on and they're still out there. That wasn't the end of life. That was the beginning of their afterlife. But the other thing that these shows tell us is there are always mysteries, right? We're here, we're plumbers during the day, but at night we investigate ghosts. And we're here at this house where this girl died, and they're investigating, and they're like, oh, we think she was killed by her uncle. And that's why she's haunting it, because she needs justice. And what all these shows say, therefore, is the dead cry out for justice. That there's an unresolved issue here that the dead are still lingering about to get justice for. And after 9/11, when America's all, who wants some? Come at me, bruh. Yeah, the ghost narratives tell us that. Our dead demand justice. Our dead demand vengeance. Our dead are out because they want. And lastly, the ghost as terrorists. There are ghosts in this house, and they're not Casper. They're not just making noise. They are out to scare you and terrify you and drive you away. And so the smart thing to do is investigate and then get rid of them. So ghost shows alone are telling us a lot about where we stood right after 9/11.
Mm.
So for me, we're about to play and talk about werewolves. Everyone's like, werewolves are about the beast within. No, they're not. The beast within is just the only obvious thing. When you look at other werewolf narratives, they're almost always about some larger sociophobic, which is an academic word, meaning the thing that scares society. So you couldn't have a
Mm.
film like Dog Soldiers, which is about English soldiers in Scotland on a mission being attacked by werewolves before the war in Iraq. You could not have The Howling and An American Werewolf in London until the middle of the 1980s, because they're dealing with very specific 80s issues. So Ginger Snaps, My Mom's a Werewolf, Howling 2, Your Sister is a Werewolf, all dealing with, sort of post fourth wave feminist issues through werewolves. So
Yeah.
horror is almost never about the thing itself. It's also always about what scares us, not individually, spiders, snakes, sharks, but what scares us collectively, which is why, hence in the book 9/11, 9/11 changes horror. All horror suddenly becomes about the things that scared us on 9/11 and get filtered through that experience. So, and again, it's a very long-winded answer to what was otherwise a simple question. And the other reason being, I like it. I like horror, and I don't think it's necessarily endangering my soul, and it's telling me narratives that that I appreciate and value. So it's, at the risk of sounding cocky and even obnoxious, I'm like, if watching Friday the 13th makes you a huge sinner and drives you away from God, then you're doing something wrong in the first place. That's not the movie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is a
And I
great
can
point.
and I can agree with that point too. And I love the different connections that you pointed out, between our society and how we view things and how that's represented in the movies. You brought up the topic of werewolves, and you're right. We haven't actually talked about werewolves yet, so maybe we should open up to a werewolf question here, as a reference to our deep dive theme. What what's your opinion on why werewolves aren't really portrayed more in film and TV? Our current theory right now is that they aren't we like to just use the term, they aren't sexy enough. Oh,
Oh, see, I first of all, I'm going to argue with your thesis. Who says werewolves aren't appearing enough? There are a ton of werewolf stories out there. Not all of them
well,
are like, they don't get maybe as much attention as the vampire stuff. Like vampires are
Yeah,
dominant
that's
monsters,
what we were referring
and
to.
that's
Like the
and zombies and ghosts are pretty big. But there's a lot of werewolf stuff out there, and admittedly, it is a subgenre. You have to have a
mhm,
taste for it. But if you have a taste for it, there's academic sources. Uh, Brian Frost's book, The Reader's Guide, The Essential Guide to Werewolf Literature. There's a book called Phases of the Moon, which is all about werewolf cinema. That's absolutely brilliant. And I actually wrote an academic article about 10 years ago talking about, it's all about the clash of civilizations right now, monster or vampires and werewolves, because you have the whole Underworld series, you have Twilight, well, preferably not, but you have it. Which again, there's True Blood, and in all three of these, vampires above, werewolves below. The vampires are aristocratic, werewolves are always working class. The vampires are living in their palaces and going to their, sort of goth raves, the Blood Room and Blade. And the
mhm.
werewolves are like the working class guys who ride motorcycles and hang out in dive bars. I'm like, why are the werewolves always like the working class guys, working class werewolves? Even What We Do with the Shadows. You've got the vampires who
Yes.
are sexy, and then you have the werewolves, not swear wolves, who are kind of goofy.
well,
Although the
Buffy the
vampires are
Vampire
also
Slayer,
goofy.
that's been the show I've been rewatching, and Oz
Yeah.
has a whole character arc as a werewolf.
Hmm. I think partly it's because the werewolf lore has never really sort of been settled. For me, I find werewolves incredibly open. You can play with them.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And there are all sorts of narratives that are like, no, that whole silver thing is a lie. No, that whole full moon thing is a lie. That we're able to sort of play with the tropes of the character and play with it. I've seen some great werewolf stuff lately. The book and the Netflix series of Hemlock Grove, Viking Wolf just came out recently. Wolf Cop 2, Canadian werewolf films. Was it Werewolves Within, which is
Yeah,
delightful and fun
I
and
I'm
funny.
gonna talk about that on the deep dive actually.
Yes. So
I
there's
haven't heard
there's
of that
a
one
lot of
yet.
werewolfy out there. And of
Hmm.
course, when you talk to people about like great 80s horror, somewhere in that top 10 list will either be The Howling, An American Werewolf in London, or both. And I
Mhm.
think what it is the werewolf film, pardon the pun, goes through phases, like the moon. We have periods of like, thank you very much. I'll be here all week. Uh, you have like these periods of really great werewolf films, and then these periods where they either go away or a giant piece of cat comes out where you're like, why does that exist? Like was it 2010 that Universal tried to reboot The Wolfman with Benicio del Toro and Anthony Hopkins, and
Yes,
everyone was
as
like,
actually one of the films I watched
"I'm
Yeah.
so
for our deep
sorry.
dive and all.
Are you okay? Do you need a hug?"
You know, I mean, at the time of this release, I've already talked about it. I didn't mind it. It had its ups and downs. There were things in comparison to the original that
Yeah.
I could appreciate more, but ultimately, remakes are remakes, and
Yeah.
they just historically they're not as good as the
And that's
original.
just it, is there are so many more inventive, interesting indie werewolf films out there. There's a British film called Howl about a train that gets stopped out in the middle of the woods surrounded by werewolves. And it's like, that's so good. It's really good. Late Phases, one of my favorite filmmakers, Jim Mickle and Nick D'Amici, they write together, and then Nick acts and Jim directs. And Nick plays a blind veteran who moves into a sort of elderly community. And he's a blind veteran. And it turns out one of the people living in the elderly community is a werewolf. And so it's about a blind veteran trying to track down and kill a werewolf. And it's so inventive and interesting, and it's low budget, but the effects are so good. So I as a fan, truth be told, I prefer werewolves to vampires. I find them so much more interesting. I find the narratives more fun. And there's some great werewolf novels out there. There's great werewolf film. There's great werewolf TV. And then there's also crappy werewolf TV. There's a series on Netflix called The Order. Sorry if you're a fan or if you made it, but it's about a secret society at school that is battling a group of werewolves that also happen to attend the same school. I'm like, this is terrible planning on someone's part. Like, I should at least be like rival schools. Why? We are the werewolf slayers. We are the werewolves. Why are you both at this university? Shouldn't like one of you go somewhere in Ohio or something? Like, seems like that would be safer, more sense. I
Yeah.
don't get it. I don't get it. But I'll also tell you one other thing. I think CG has sort of ruined werewolf movies, because when you look at the physical transformations and like the howling that are physical effect, you look at the practical effects of American Werewolf in London, that transformation sequence where David Naughton in full light becomes a werewolf. Those are scary and brilliant and gross and wonderful. But when you watch something like Wes Craven's Cursed, where, Pacey from Dawson's Creek, sorry, spoiler alert, is a werewolf. Come on, dude. Oh, and Jesse Eisenberg too. What are we doing? Why are we doing this?
Yeah.
It's CG werewolfery, and it looks so bad. So it's not scary, it's just sad and painful. But you see a really good werewolf transformation, even a good CG transformation. That's some scary stuff, man. And that's the problem, is you know who vampires are, and mostly vampires, in theory, can't go out in the sun. Yet another invention of cinema. And when you go back into the myths of these things, if you're a werewolf in life, you become a vampire during death. No one's
Oh,
played with that thing, yeah.
interesting.
Huh.
Or you became a werewolf through a deal with the devil, that you make a deal with the devil, and the devil gives you a wolf pelt belt or a wolf skin that when you put on, or a
Yeah.
cream that when you rub it on, turns you into a werewolf. And Hollywood comes along and says, "Nay, there are other things you can do." And so, it's the artist, it's the fiction that took this interesting mythology about shape changing and put it, started adding all of this other stuff. Oh, it's only during the full moon. Oh, silver bullets killed them. Like, they're German werewolves from the 14th century. You can kill them with a sword. It doesn't need to be silver. They're just physical bodies. They're like wolves. You can hack them apart. Get them with a couple arrows. You're good. So
Yeah.
okay,
Well, so if you were going to survive against a werewolf, if we were using like traditional
okay.
terms like full moon,
Mhm.
I'll say like artist creativity, you can kill them basically how you would want. But what would you do with a werewolf if you had like, are you a fight, flight, or freeze? What would you do if you're like in the woods, you come across a werewolf, they transform, and you can tell in their mind they're going to be like, I'm going to eat you.
Right. Well, see, and this is why I think werewolves are cool horror monsters. Zombie, shoot him in the head, cut off the head, done. And they're not that strong individually. It's in groups that zombies are dangerous. Vampire's
Mhm.
scary, but sunlight means at least half the day we're cool.
Yeah.
And fill the room with crosses, garlic, holy water, give yourself a steak, and you got a pretty good shot of making it through the night. Werewolf, first of all, you don't know who's a werewolf because they're human most of the time. And second of all, unlike zombies, individuals are incredibly strong. They're not that easily killed. If you go by both the sort of mythos and the Hollywood version, you can cut off an arm, shoot it through the heart, and it's going to still keep coming. So they're a little bit unstoppable, and that's problematic because if they bite you, then they pass along the lycanthropy. Now you're going to be one. So it's one of these things where a zombie can touch you and you're fine. You can like keep its mouth away and put the shotgun in the face, and you're all right. With a werewolf, man, you've got this thing that's super agile, super fast, has the strength of a wolf. and you got to take it down before it touches you. Because if that mouth gets on you, if it pierces the skin and whatever it is that causes it gets in you, it's over. So for me, I think what saves you is height. You
Mhm.
get somewhere high.
Okay.
You
Mhm.
if I'm planning werewolf trapping, I go out in the woods, I cut down all the trees but one in like a 30-foot radius. Like in Jurassic Park, you put a high height up there. All walls are all the windows are covered with steel mesh, and I want to be up there with first and foremost guns with with silver bullets, but I also want at least two silver tip spears and sword or three silver because blades don't need reloading. And if this thing is fast enough, also I don't do it alone. If you're
Mm.
doing this, you need at least three people to corner it and take it down, even up in the high height,
And
because this gets the drop on one, the other two can go after it. So you need a group. But and then the biggest thing, of course, is I remind myself and everyone else, don't get cocky. This thing is a successful killer. It is designed by nature to take me down. So just like, swimming with the great white, there's an advantage and it's not mine. Even
Yeah.
if I have a spear gun, the great white is in its own element with all of its own stuff, and it's bigger and it's got more teeth, and I get one shot and it gets all of them. Think of the werewolf as a great white. So be careful before you put yourself into its world, and then go in with the tools to finish the job quickly and completely. Don't be
All
like,
right.
I'm gonna go in with my revolver and 6 shots. Got this. Nope, 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 nope. That's the fastest way to become a hamburger.
That was awesome. I feel like you broke that down so well. And
Mhm.
as we're wrapping up in here, I want to ask just a quick couple horror movie specific questions, and
Sure.
then we will head over to Call of Cthulhu pretty soon. What
Indeed.
was the first horror movie you remember seeing?
The short answer is I don't remember the first one. I remember asking my parents to take me to see The Omen when I was 6, and then when it came out, and them saying, absolutely not. And me being like, okay, can I buy the novelization? And they're like, yeah, sure, go ahead. Because I was allowed to read whatever I wanted, but they were worried about movies. And I asked them about The Exorcist, because my parents went to see it. They're like, oh, that's a terrible movie, it's scaring you. And it's one of my favorite films of all time. So surely I've made up for lost time. There were two things that sort of came about. I remember seeing some of the Universal films, Dracula, the Wolfman, Frankenstein, because my grandfather told me, he was born in, I think, 1917. So he's like, oh, I saw Frankenstein when it came out in the movie theater. It's the scariest thing I've ever seen. So 8-year-old me is like, oh, I got to watch Frankenstein. I'm watching it going, I've lost respect for my grandfather. Like, how is this scary? This is sad. But I remember seeing Jaws when it was on TV and being
Oh,
scared by it. But also, I grew up in the age that, because I'm old, I grew up in the age where before cable, we just had 4 channels, the 3 networks and PBS, and then there were like 3 or 4 indie channels out of New York and Boston, because I lived in Connecticut almost halfway between the two. On good days, we could get in maybe a total of 8 channels.
wow.
So my local NBC affiliate would have the 4 o'clock movie every day from 4 to 6. They would show a movie, and they would have theme weeks. So this is Romance Week. This is Gregory Peck Week, and about 3 or 4 times a year they would have Scary Week. One would be in October, but there'd be like for whatever reason there'd be one in June and one in January. So 3 times a year I'd just rush home and watch whatever was on, and it might be Food of the Gods, it might be The Rats, it might be, oh, The Rats Are Coming, The Werewolves Are Here, one of the best titles of all time, the Tower of Evil. So I saw Crowhaven Witches. See, I remember all these. And also I remember them because my mother would serve dinner at 6, so I never saw the ending of any of them. At like 10 to
No.
6, she'd be
Oh.
like, go wash up. I'm like, Mom, there's 10 minutes left in the movie. She's like, go wash up, we're having dinner. Fine. I'm like leaving it on, sticking my head out of the bathroom, trying to see down the hall. And she'd go in and turn it off, and I'd be like, whatever. So when VHS finally came out, I'd start renting these movies and just fast forward to the end to finally find out what happened.
Oh my goodness.
And then when I was a little older, the first movie I remember seeing in a movie theater was when I was in junior high. I won a radio station contest to go see Cujo. So my best friend and I went on a date with this girl that I had a crush on, and her best friend who had a crush on my best friend. So I liked her, she didn't like me, and her friend liked my friend, and he didn't like her. So it was the most awkward date ever. But we all
Oh my
saw Cujo
gosh.
together. And
And
so I
that's
do
a
remember that.
shared experience that you would all remember.
Indeed.
Hmm.
So, and again, and this is my same friend Tom that I've grown up with, played D&D with, all this stuff. He and I saw so many horror movies in the theater on VHS. We sought them out. We loved them. We'd watch them. We'd rate them. So yes, in my lifetime, I've seen thousands, if not tens of thousands of horror movies, some over and over. There's some that I watch every year. Some I teach a horror cinema class for LMU. So there's about a dozen or so films that I see every year just in class. But so I show Halloween to the class, but I also watch the original Halloween in October because you gotta.
You
I
got
show them
it.
Trick or Treat, but I also watch Trick or Treat during Halloween because you gotta. I show them John Carpenter's The Thing, but I will watch The Thing anytime. That is such a good film. So I show them The Exorcist, and I've seen that. I went to The Exorcist. Coolest. I've done two really cool things with The Exorcist. I've done a lot of cool things with The Exorcist, but I saw The Exorcist at Hollywood Forever Cemetery with a Jesuit friend of mine,
Oh,
and I went to Cinespia, which shows movies on the side of a mausoleum in Hollywood Forever Cemetery. I'm sitting there with a Jesuit, and he had a sweater on, so you couldn't see the collar. We're watching the film, and the exorcism begins, and he goes, "That doesn't happen. That happens. That happens a lot more than that." And the person sitting next to us goes, "How do you know?" And he just pulls down the sweater to show the priest collar. I'm like, "Oh!" And suddenly, everyone sitting around us is listening. His father's going, "That happens. Yeah, that happens a lot." And I was like, "You've been in an
whoa.
exorcism?" He's like, "Observed." Whoa. And then I also saw The Exorcist at the old Los Angeles Zoo in Griffith Park. There was a summer where they would get an inflatable screen and show movies. And there's no light. Like you have to, they're like, bring your cell phone, bring a flashlight, find your way to the old zoo lion enclosure, and you sit in the lion enclosure and watch a film. The Exorcist starts, and you have to wait until it's dark enough to show movies outdoors at night. And within about 10 minutes, there is a giant cloud of weed smoke over the crowd. And I'm
Oh,
just sitting there going, who gets high and watches The Exorcist? Like this is not the film to wait for the edibles to kick in for.
No,
No,
it's
no, no,
not.
yeah, that
no,
doesn't
get
sound
right
like a
out of here,
smart move.
guys. And yeah, there were some people there who had a very bad trip, I think, because you hear like screams, and then you'd hear like people talking back to the screen slowly. Don't do that, Reagan. That's not cool. You're like, that guy's high. You made a mistake, my friend.
Yeah, bad decision. Don't do it that
Yeah.
way.
So I've even seen
Wow.
it in German. When I was in Austria, I went to see Der Exorcist. And for some reason, it is scarier in German.
Well, I
Oh
mean,
my
it is a
goodness.
very harsh language. I imagine hearing like praying being yelled out and
Indeed,
exorcising a demon in German, it would be
it
terrifying to
is.
hear.
Well, The Exorcist is one of my favorite films, so much so to the point my mother, who hates horror, is willing to play along with me. If you know anything about The Exorcist, it's Father Damien Karras and his mother, and she calls him Demi. So every once in a while, my mother will call me up and say, "Demi, it's me." And I yell into the phone, "You're not my mother." And she'll say, "Demi, why you leave me to die? Demi, please." And I'm like, "Thank you, Mom. Thank you for
Oh,
playing the mother from The Exorcist for me."
Oh
that's
my
so
goodness.
sweet.
Yeah. My mother's a very
Wow.
good person. I give her nothing but credit. She put up with me as I was growing up. This sort of well-read childhood weirdo who knew a lot and wanted a lot and wanted to see things that she's like, I wouldn't watch that movie. It's too scary. I'm like, yeah, because you're a lightweight. I'm 10. Come on, let's do this thing.
That's just wonderful. I I want to ask, I know you love horror, but is there any like tropes or like least favorite movies that you have that you're like, if you want to join the horror field, don't do that?
Oh, I mean, there are a ton. Don't do all the cliches. We've seen them all. Don't talk about elevated horror. Don't say that you're going to make elevated horror because that's so snobby and that's so, oh, I this is elevated horror, which implies that the rest of horror is garbage horror. And I'm like,
Hmm.
look, first of all, you can't argue taste. One of my favorite movies is called Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things. I do not recommend it to anyone. I love it probably because I first saw it when I was 12 on TV, and then when it came out, I have it on VHS. I have two different DVD versions. I got it autographed by the co-writer and star. It was made by the same director who did A Christmas Story, Bob Clark.
Interesting.
The guy who did The Christmas Story also did Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things. And it's about a
Huh.
theater company that goes to rehearse on an island off the coast of Florida. And as a joke, they bring along a grimoire and do a ritual to awaken the dead, and all of the dead wake up. So it's a zombie movie, but it's with actors from the early 70s. So they're wearing bell bottoms, they're wearing these incredible tops, they all have ridiculous hair. No one's wearing undergarments. It's just so beautifully classless. And I love it because it's a love letter to theater. And there are some great performances and some horrible performances, and no one enjoys this film except everyone who loves this film. Loves this film. Every 2 or 3 years, somewhere here in LA, it'll be on the big screen. They'll put it at the New Beverly or the Arrow, and it always sells out because there's a small group of us that are like, this film on the big screen is a perfect thing. And it is so much fun. But if you ask me what my favorite film is, I would tell you it's not a horror film. It's Shichinin no Samurai, Kurosawa's The Seven Samurai. It is the most perfect a film can be. Brilliant, moving, funny, smart, incredible fight sequences, incredibly human. The story is so good. Again, another film I've seen hundreds of times. Every year, somewhere it's on the big screen in Los Angeles, and I would step over my own mother to go see it again on the big screen. Because I own the Criterion Collection Blu-ray. I can watch it anytime I want, but to see it on a full screen the way it was supposed to be seen is incredible. So, and then I think 5 out of the next 7 films are all horror. There are 2 other non-horror in my favorites, but
Dang.
there you go.
I'm going to have to add that to my watch list. Well, you introduced me to one of my favorite horror films, Killer Clowns from Outer Space.
Killer Clowns from Outer Space,
which is Nick's least favorite. He's terrified of it and has never gotten through the whole thing.
I get it.
No, those are 2 lies. I never said that. I never said I didn't finish it. I did finish it. First off,
you are terrified of it.
I am terrified of it.
Yeah,
would I ever watch it again? Of course, but
do you not like clowns?
Oh no, I'm totally fine with clowns. I love clowns.
It's the Killer Clowns from Outer Space.
It's the fact that they all have basically, I don't know if you know the term toon force. It's a term I was recently introduced to. It's the fact that they're all toon force powered creatures, and obviously they lean towards a chaotic nature. So
indeed,
that's the true thing that is terrifying to me.
See, and that's why I think werewolves are better than vampires, because vampires are order monsters. There are rules for vampires, and they have to follow the rules. And werewolves are like rule schmools. Let's get to it.
Exactly.
They're chaos muppets, man.
I'm so glad that you also like werewolves more than vampires. I've always been a werewolf fan. So
yeah, I'm team werewolf and team zombie and team ghost. I'll tolerate vampires. I've written about vampires. I've watched a lot of vampire movies. I've seen some good ones. There's a fun one from Canada called Blood and Donuts that I really like. But about a vampire who goes to sleep for 25 years after the moon landing and wakes up in the mid-90s in Toronto being like, this is a completely different world after 25 years. And so he spends all of his time at an all-night donut shop getting to know people and deciding who to eat and who to help. And I thought at the time it was a very clever film in terms of exploring one of the aspects of vampirism that almost never gets touched on, these sort of long periods of inactivity and what happens when you emerge into a culture that you know nothing about.
Yeah, that is really cool. Most cinema doesn't like cover that a whole lot, or if they touch on it, it's very brief, as if like kind of like Marvel when they're like, oh yeah, Thor knows how to use a toaster. Like, no, he's a god from years ago. I don't think he's gonna figure out how to use a toaster.
Yeah, but like you watch the Underworld films and they're like, oh, here's a vampire that has been hibernating for 500 years. It's like, hello, bring me a cell phone. And you're like, how does he know about
that's inaccurate?
No, dude. Whereas the werewolves are like, give me another beer, then I'm gonna kick this guy's ass. Like, yeah, working class monster. I'm there.
We love a working class monster.
Gotta love the working class monsters.
Well, one more question as we wrap up the interview. You just shared so much wisdom, but if you could wrap up like one piece of wisdom for people who want to pursue an entertainment industry, what would you say? Someone's like, I want to do this. How?
Make other people say no. Don't say no to yourself. Make other people say no. People will tell you no, and that's fine. That's part of the business. I've been told no more than I've been told yes. But like the man says, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. So make other people say no. I've been told no. I want to do this. No. Okay. The only way you get to do stuff as an artist is asking or saying, I'm going to do this, and making other people say no. And when they don't say no, you get to do it. Yeah. So, don't stop yourself. There are enough people out there who are more than happy to stop you. Don't stop yourself. And that's not just art, that's life. You want to ask someone out? Ask them out. You want to go to something? Go to it. Make other people say no. Don't say no to yourself. You do it. Yeah. Let others stop you.
I think that's really good advice. So
do you want to do a quick plug at the end of the interview of what you're currently working on.
You can go to my website, www.somethingwetmorethiswaycomes, all one word.com. Easy to
Love
remember.
it.
Something Wetmore This Way Comes. Wetmore, no H, spelled like I went out in the rain and got wet more. And then there's a lot of stuff there. There's Amazon links to all of my books and anthologies that contain my short stories, magazines that contain my short stories. I'm directing a show at LMU in the spring, a Japanese show called Akaioni. I'm directing Troilus and Cressida for Shakespeare on the Bluff in the summer of 24. I've got a couple books coming out next year. I just had a book come out called Theater in the Macabre. I co-edited it with Meredith Conti, and it's all about horror theater. The follow-up to that is called Stage Fright, which is a solo written volume that I have coming out next year. My book on Lovecraft and the theater will follow on that. And I'm surrounded by piles of books because I have another several projects lined up after that. So keeping busy.
Yay!
Thank you, Kevin, for your time. And I just want to say thank you to our listeners for taking time to listen to this amazing interview. Don't forget to give us a like. Don't forget to subscribe. And check us out for our next episode where Kevin will join us again. We'll be playing Call of Cthulhu, and Kylie and I are going to see if we can beat the werewolf. Well, so long, everybody.
Bye now.